The last thing I asked ChatGPT was whether it had any updates or plugins that might be useful for finding out whether students are using ChatGPT, actually, because a lot of the reason I'm using it is in a way to identify to what extent there's a possibility of a usage for an essay, because we are finding that it's happening at university level potentially. And one thing that we notice, for example, is if students are answering a question not using material from the course, from the module, but they've found a list of types of answers, we often find that the list is the same across essays. So it's really to try and identify students' usage. So far that's what I've been using ChatGPT for. So the last question was about that. The truth is AI does not exist, at least at a general purpose or universal level. What we have now is going toward that direction, but it's effectively still a regression model. So when you talk about certain aspects of what AI could be, for example, the databases that collect images, that collect different text, the different recognizable labels, as it were, then the databases then can feed into something that then has its own machine learning capability. So that means we assume that the intelligence that is exemplified from AI reflects human intelligence. So the difficulty is, of course, even human intelligence is complicated and not singular. So I think what this supposed hype around, what the hype around supposed AI reflects is confusion, I think, around human intelligence. And I think it's problematic not because AI might change society, but it might change our critical thinking and our necessity to identify what's human about the human and about intelligence as being progressive for society, which matters given the move to the far right in a lot of the different parts of the world. So that's how I talk about AI, that I think we need to move a little bit back to thinking about human rather than artificial intelligence. So that's why it matters. We can talk also about data collection at a more general level, because one case where it has proven to be kind of useful is in the UK Pilots Union, where data was collected about pilots. And of course, some of that data goes into that AI domain because it was sort of the stress level or emotion collection of data. So if workers have access to the kinds of data that reflect their working conditions, whether or not there's AI used, the point is that workers can then negotiate around better conditions for the work environment if stress can be related and correlated with negative working conditions or too much work or change in the working environment. So a workplace restructure can result in emotional difficulties and stress. So if there's, for some reason, a technology being used to collect data about yourself, whether it's the location where you are at work, your emotion, your tone of voice, proximity to another worker, or how long you've spent at your desk, if workers have access to that data, then it can be used potentially to make a link between their feelings and the work environment and maybe even sickness. And then you can make claims around and questions about improvement for work. It does take a strong worker representative to make that point, that technically we do have the right to access the data that's collected around us and about us. And personal data, I mean, the clue should be in the name, personal. So access is something that I am arguing in my work, that the issue could be victimization when you feel there's no automatic access to the data. But then even when you do have access to it, I talk about that as the question could be that then the data is understood as property. And just because you have something doesn't mean you can do something. So having, doing, and being are all different qualifiers. So just because you have access doesn't mean you can then enact some change. So it really requires there to be more of a collective discussion around it and mobilization around access that can have a positive impact. So, well, sentiment analysis is pretty prevalent, and that's where text is collected from communications between the, let's say, person doing IT support and clients. And there are different words that are identified, and that is use of a large language model. So the text that can be identified as not legitimate or not useful then can be coded and can be used for potentially for penalizing a worker. But it depends, of course, on the jurisdiction. Technically, you would find that to be problematic in some parts of the world, but then that's why I'm talking about emotion recognition as having we're going to really need to keep an eye on how things are defined, because sentiment analysis coming out of text and data scraping means that, again, only certain coded words are understood to be problematic, but then an emotion is physiologically and physically potentially expressed. So then why is sentiment analysis potentially not recognition in the emotion recognition? And so I don't like to only use law as a defense at all, partly because especially big tech are developing so quickly, and that's why I also talk about sandboxes potentially being useful. But technology is seen with an innovation point to a lot of what comes out of what happens with the technology, especially supposedly if it's AI. There's some unpredictability about the nature of that technology. So a lot of it comes out of testing, period. So in answer to your question, just because the data is available, that's collected, whether or not AI is used, doesn't necessarily mean that it provides a potential for worker defense. But I think it's at least the right step in the right direction. So data should be automatically available to a worker. Also the data protection officer and also the boss and also the manager and whoever it is should be telling workers why the data is being collected, and actually the data should not be used for any other reason besides what's being expressed for collection. So that's also, of course, part of GDPR. Not always followed, but at least it's a step in the right direction. So spied upon is interesting because it has a surveillance dimension to it. And the way that surveillance is usually talked about when it's negative for workers is when it feels creepy, and that's a term that's being used more and more. So the creepy or icky. So it, as usual, depends on dialogue. So social dialogue, to what extent workers also have voice. So this can be linked to potentially to the industry itself. So in a buoyant economy, in a buoyant industry where workers are being paid properly and already have quite a lot of rights and a lot of, there's a safety net. So let's say ideal scenario, the positive aspect is that a worker feels empowered, feels confident to say what data is being collected, to ask, to know, to already have been told. But again, I keep going back to the data minimization and purposefulness. I keep going back to that to think, actually, companies don't necessarily need flashy new technologies for the workplace to run well. And I think there needs to be a lot more discussion around purpose, limitation, and proportionality. And I think there needs to be a lot more pressure put on companies to justify investment in technologies. Also, open and transparent communication, discussion around why the technology is being invested in. Worker involvement, where there can be not just an opt-in, opt-out where the technology is rolled out for workers consenting meaningfully or not, but the question with procurement. We need a lot more real negotiation and real discussion around what technology should be purchased and not. But that's not a very popular thing to say during effectively what is a recession. So there needs to be a balance across innovation. Supposedly we need the innovation dimension, but we also need companies to be careful especially when it's coming to human resources and operations. Why do you need these new technologies? Whether or not it's AI. Is it just to keep up with your competitor, or is there a really good reason to invest in it, involve the workers? And I think it's going to be a bit better for everyone. I mean, I tend to be known as skeptical and the dark, and more than happy to talk about the dark side, which may or may not make groups feel uncomfortable. I think it's a good moment in history to feel a little bit uncomfortable, because there are reasons why that discomfort happens. Where that comes from is around, I would say, very much in a liberal society, specific expected rights for there to be a democratic potential for the future. And what that has to do with is if there is a new actor in the game, which is technology, and if the robot, whether it's a robot, whether it's an algorithm, whether it's another kind of, a very specific bit of software, my view is that we're inviting it as though it's a solution, but solutions should be sought, I think, from human intelligence first and foremost. Where that comes about, where that human intelligence comes from is not by recording personal data, extracting data at such an extreme level, putting it into a database, turning it into a machine that starts to ask its own questions, starts to answer its own questions, and then also starts to modify behavior itself. So where we were originally the data producers, now the production and the data itself changes the behavior. So we have a whole feedback loop that has become potentially something disempowering. So my point would be to remain skeptical and also look as much as possible at ways of creating social relations without technology rather than with.